Welcome everybody to this special Safe Sport workshop where Jennifer Keith from BC Artistic Swimming has agreed to present their Evolve project. And I have to say, I can't wait to hear this. I've been hearing about this project since I started this role at the end of August, and I can't wait to dive into the details. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional unceded and ancestral lands of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. And we have more people trying to come in. So I may just pass this over to Jennifer while I try and let the rest of these people in. So thank you, Jennifer, over to you.
Super, thank you, Andrea, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Very quickly, before I tell you just a little smidgen about myself, I do want to acknowledge that most of you by now have probably met Nadia Kaiba, who is on the line as well, and who's now working with Via Sport on some of the Safe Sport portfolio work. And Nadia was a key player in our Evolve project. So I will be bringing Nadia in a little while too to share a little bit of what she did with us, but just wanted to introduce her as well. So as Andrea mentioned, I'm Jennifer Keith. Most of you have probably seen me in meetings, especially over the last couple of years, as we've been meeting regularly by Zoom and various online platforms. But I've been the executive director of BC Artistic Swimming now for 5 years. I have over now, well into closer to 25 than 20 years of experience in the sports sector in Canada. I've worked at the local club level all the way up to national organizations. And before joining BC Artistic Swimming, I had been working for 7+ years with the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, and particularly with their True Sport Engagement team. And was excited to bring that knowledge into the work we've done. So we've I've been doing my best to try and do that in my role here. And that is, I think, a little bit of how we led into doing this project. Similar to what Andrea just acknowledged, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm originating this meeting for me from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Halkomelem and Squamish speaking people. That was home to several ancestors of Coast Salish nations, including the Cootsie, Tsawwassen, Coquitlam, Tsleil-Waututh, Stolo, Kakite, and Musqueam First Nations. And I'm very fortunate, although I'm an uninvited guest, to live, play, work, and raise my family on these lands. So let's dive into it. How did we get here? How did we end up with this Evolve project? When I started 5 years ago, we had just had a significant changeover of our board of directors at BC Artistic Swimming, and they were looking at how do we do what we're doing better? How do we make our sport better? What can we do? And so we looked at undertaking a bit of a, let's find out what the state of artistic swimming is in BC. And we set out doing some town hall consultations. We looked at risk management. We created a risk registry. We conducted at that time, the last Via Sport evaluation, which really gives you a deep dive into what you're doing as an organization. And then once you get the results, you get to find out what you're doing well and where there are gaps for improvement. And that was a big part as well of our evaluation of our overall state of artistic swimming. We did what we called the good, the bad, and the ugly consultations. And we basically said, if we're going down this road, then we need to know what we're talking about. So we need to know what is good about our sport, what is great. And at our annual summit, we did in-person sessions where we got people to talk about what do you love about the sport? What brings you back? And we talked to parents about this. We talked to athletes and coaches and got them all to give us that feedback. We then got them to talk about what do you not like so much? What aren't the great things about your sport experience in artistic swimming? And then we did an anonymous and very confidential survey that was tell us about the ugly. What are the things that you wouldn't be comfortable or you weren't comfortable talking about in the session about the good and the bad? What are the things that you haven't brought forward for some reason? And it was really eye-opening to see some of the issues that were happening in our sport when people were asked in a confidential and anonymous way to give us that information. We did a coaches survey. Our coaches generally said, yeah, there are problems in our sport, but it's not us. we're doing everything we should be doing, and we're certainly not the problem. And I think generally speaking, we have a lot of great coaches, but I think there was a gap there in their understanding of how they were contributing to our culture. And we began to do work around True Sport, bringing True Sport to life in our organization. And we were at the start of doing safe sport training and education. And what did we find out of all of this? Essentially, the findings were that although we had been made a commitment to advocate for true sport and a values-based sport environment, little change was happening. There was very little uptake in what we were doing. But what we did find from our consultations was that there was harassment in our sport. There was toxicity among our members and among clubs. There was poor coaching practices. There was inappropriate behavior at all levels. There was poor leadership. There was a significant and likely, I dare say, severe lack of trust, whether it was trust in BC artistic swimming, trust among coaches, trust among clubs, trust between athletes and coaches. And there was conflict between a lot of organizations. Within and between organizations and people, there were issues. There was conflict. There were old, we call it the mush, we take from Nadia, the old mush, just stuff left behind from conflict over the years that hadn't been resolved. And what the outcome of this was that we were finding there was coach burnout, there were poor retention rates, there was poor morale, and it increased conflict because the conflict was already there on the surface. So we started to think about, now what do we do? How do we resolve this? How do we get through this? How do we even begin? And we came up with a hypothesis. So our hypothesis was that culture change is fundamentally personal, and for culture change to succeed, sport leaders must become more self-aware. They need to understand how they contribute to culture, whether that is a positive contribution or a negative contribution. How are they contributing to the sport environment that has been created in our sport? We needed everybody to understand their role in mitigating, managing, and resolving problems and issues. And we needed to ensure that our members acquired the skill to deliver values-based sports programming. And so we believed that fundamentally changing our culture needed to ensure that everybody had effective communication skills and that we had an understanding of ethical literacy and how to develop ethical literacy in addition to physical literacy in our sport. So we felt that our hypothesis generally was, if we can have create a common understanding and agreement on how to communicate and resolve conflict, then sport leaders will be able to move towards a high trust culture. And ultimately that high trust culture will improve the quality of the sport experience, will attract more participants, will retain those participants once we get them, and we will reduce social barriers that deter participation. And then overall, we will support the social and personal development of participants. So it was, I still look back at this that was written 3+ years ago now and think, wow, what were we thinking? We had huge aspirations to be able to do this. And but we were ready for it. And so we applied for funding, basically is what happened. And we were fortunate to get funding from the Sport Canada Innovation Fund, integration grant. And they provided us with 18 months of funding to change our culture. So, I mean, that in of itself, just to get started, is a little bit laughable that we're going to change culture in 18 months. But what I'm going to share with you today is what we were able to accomplish in that 18 months with that funding, and a little bit of a year later, what am I seeing? What do I see today as a result of all of this? So our formula for success really came down to building 6 areas where we were going to focus our attention. The first was foundation, and that was basically helping organizations lead, whether it was our own organization as BC Artistic Swimming or supporting our clubs in their organizational development to build the foundation, because without that strong foundation, the rest would continue to flounder. Next was the intervention, and that came into the interpersonal communications that I spoke to that we felt were fundamental. If we can't talk to each other effectively, if we can't manage issues effectively, how do we even move forward? And that's where Nadia came in, and I will give her a chance to share a little bit about that with you in a bit. The other part was growth. Our growth component was really about coaching development, helping our coaches to identify new coaching strategies, innovative ways of looking at what we do, using growth mindset in all aspects of how they coach, looking at how True Sport really fits in at all levels of what they do. And it also included the Advanced Coach Project. So when I talked about that there was mush, we literally had coaches that hadn't spoken to each other in years, or if they did, it always resulted in conflict. And we needed counseling. We needed family therapy. And we recognized that. And one of the consultants that we brought in is a specialist in organizational behavior, but also a clinical counselor, and was able to work with people and groups on some of those personal, interpersonal issues that had been remaining for years so that we could come out the other side and be able to work together. In terms of prevention and environment, this is where we really focused on some of the safe sport components. And really, it was about becoming the organization we want to be, and being able to self-monitor that and look at how we're being inclusive, how we're creating safe environments for everybody involved. And a big component for us was sharing. And so there are the typical what we're doing online and what our presence is, what our branding is, and all of those things. And we shifted some of that in concert with this project. But I would say the most impactful piece around sharing was creating opportunities for peer sharing among our members. And I will speak to that a little bit more as well, but it really was an opportunity that we couldn't give everybody all the opportunity to do everything at a high level, but we did give those the opportunity who participated in very in-depth components of our project to share their learnings with others in the membership. And I can tell you that, I mean, I'm sick of hearing myself half the time when I'm talking to my members, so I know they're sick of hearing from me, especially in the Zoom environment over the last 2 years. But bringing in other people to share the learnings, bringing in other people to share, and respected people within our community was really, really a big component of this project. And lastly was the impact measurement. And we partnered with the University of Ottawa on our project evaluation for this. And I'm just going to say, because I just heard her, my apologies. I didn't realize when we booked this that it was a Pro D day in my district. And so my 6-year-old is home today, and I give you a heads up that she likes to interrupt. She's been told not to, but my apologies if she does in advance. So on the right-hand side with all these logos, these are all the various partners that were brought into the project with us. And so it wasn't just us on our own. A big part of this was finding the right fit of who needs to be at the table working with us and engaging with our members. So looking at this a little bit differently, we were then saying, well, what do we expect to achieve out of all of this? And with these different components of the project. So for foundation, our expected result was that we have the tools and resources, both at the provincial level and the club level, to deliver quality sport. For intervention around our communications and conflict management, we wanted individuals to feel confident in being able to model skillful communications on and off the pool deck. And we wanted individuals to feel inspired and empowered to use training and tools to manage conflict. In growth in relation to our coaches, we wanted there to be a common understanding of how to coach athletes through a true sport lens. And we wanted them to understand what it means to intentionally include values in the sport and sport experience. So we wanted them to understand that, you know, the odd pizza party or team cheer or something fun that you do doesn't cut it. That's not enough, that there are 7 principles that need to be followed and that they need to be brought together. And we really needed them to understand what that meant at a grassroots level, at the delivery level, because we can talk about it at the provincial level, but it's those coaches that are delivering it on a day-to-day basis on the pool deck. We wanted our coaches to adopt and understand what growth mindset really meant, and to feel confident in applying new coaching philosophies with athletes. And we wanted them, as I mentioned earlier, to understand what it meant to develop ethical literacy in parallel to developing physical literacy. And in terms of our safe sport goals, we wanted our individuals to feel that they had the tools and the knowledge to advocate for a safe sport environment. Overall, this would all lead to us increasing the capacity for our sport leaders to gain confidence and knowledge and understanding communication skills and how this all really interplays on a day-to-day basis with sport delivery. So looking at these components in a little bit more detail, and what you see in the right-hand box now are the different activities that we did in relation to each of these. So there were a lot of interventions, and this is like the smaller slide really. But in terms of organizational development for our provincial organization and our clubs, we realigned our mission, vision, values, all our statements of purposes. We developed a new strategic plan. We looked at stakeholder mapping. Who are the key stakeholders that have influence in our organization, and what influence do they have? We looked at our system tools. We looked at policies. We looked at, from a safe sport lens, we used the LGBTQI2S readiness audit. We used the accessibility audit. We went through all of these different, use these different tools to be able to help us to understand our baseline and where we were at and where the gaps were, where we needed to go. We then invested in ensuring that our board of directors in particular had a clear understanding of good governance and management by values, that we did work around communications, not only how we communicate with our members, but how we communicate among ourselves, among the board and the staff. The Coach Advance worked into this. The work that was done around Coach Advance and rebuilding relationships with coaches wasn't just at the coach level. It was also between our organization and those coaches, because some of those relationships were between us and them. So, I mean, not necessarily me, it was maybe before my time, but there was still a lack of trust with us as an organization because of historical mush that existed. And we did invested in a lot of time in True Sport activation, and whether that was having the True Sport staff speak to our members about resources and tools and what engagement actually meant, to our own organization creating a True Sport activation framework that we would be continuing to implement over the coming years. For clubs, there were very similar things. And we have instituted, not necessarily as successfully as we'd hoped because there have been a lot of other challenges, but president's meetings so that we can have different discussions at the club level and different things. And we continue to embed some of the work that we've done as an organization, now filtering that down to the club level with some of our programs. Around interpersonal communication skills and conflict management, there are a host of things, a ton of things that Nadia did with us. And I think, Nadia, this would be a great time for you to maybe speak a little bit. And I will just tell you in advance that I will be sharing the communication guidelines with them a little bit later. So, but if you want to touch on, because these are all things you did with us, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. I was just thinking as I was looking at all of the work that you did pre-working with me and then that we did together. When we first jumped into this, I was sort of envisioning myself traveling around the province, working with clubs and hanging out with them. But it because of the pandemic, everything went onto Zoom. But it's kind of neat to look back at the starting point that we were at. So when Jennifer was just jumping into my portion, the first thing that I did was an introduction to conflict management workshop with the board. And that sort of speaks to what Jennifer was describing, that it was really important for her and the board to be aligned in terms of language and in terms of process that they were using when they would address conflict. And so we started there. And then we did some workshops about just how do we anticipate conflict? What are some typical conflict that comes up at the board level, right down to the athlete level? How do we anticipate it? And then how do we address it? And how do we prevent it? So we looked at different strategies together. And then we did the advanced coach discovery, which is where I think the entire club came together on a webinar. We did work with coaches as well as with athletes, and where we focused in on specific situations that they needed to address. The communications workshop was really great. We looked at values-based behaviors and came up with an agreement, and Jennifer is going to share that in a little bit. And then the next section was really my favorite part, and it speaks to what Jennifer was talking about with peer sharing. So I worked with 3 clubs, and we did intensive workshops on Zoom. And then they took about 6 weeks to go and practice some of the skills that we went through. And some of those skills were the mesh that Jennifer is speaking about. So how do you spot interpersonal mesh? How do you look at assumptions that people make? What are some typical assumptions that are happening at the club level? And then how do you address conflict once you've established that conflict is there? How do you move from positions to interests? How do you have tricky conversations? And those workshops were with board members, but also with coaches. And what ended up happening was that we came together, did the workshop, and then about 6 weeks after, we had a follow-up meeting where we talked about, well, how are things going, guys? Like, how are you implementing some of the tools and strategies that we talked about at the workshop? What are some of the spots that it's not necessarily working, and how do we troubleshoot that? And then we had peer sharing coming out of that. And that's when some of the coaches who were at the workshops reported back to the bigger organization a couple of months later. And so that was really neat, especially for me to be able to hear some of the skills and tools and strategies that they were using since the workshop. And then there's the board communication agreement, and then the provincial communication agreements that Jennifer was speaking about. But I would say that the majority of the work that I did at both the board level and the club level and the athlete level was really looking at, how do we normalize conflict? How do we create a set of consistent tools that people are using throughout the organization? So that people are speaking the same language, so that when conflict comes up, it's not something that's happening for 3 years, as Jennifer was just talking about. It's something that people aren't afraid of addressing directly. And we did have the pandemic come up, so it has been a little bit hard in terms of addressing things directly. But one of the things that I really saw in working with BC Artistic Swimming is that people started having tricky conversations. People stopped firing off angry emails. They really tried to be creative and try to address conflict more quickly when it came up in a really proactive way. So it's been very rewarding for me working with Jennifer and all of BC Artistic Swimming.
Awesome. Thank you, Nadia. And it's been rewarding for us. And I'll get to it a little bit, but we're still seeing the outcomes of the work that Nadia did with us, which is fabulous. So in terms of growth, there were just a host of, and in this case, the pandemic kind of worked in our favor of, we had this gap in sport delivery and our coaches were looking for something to do. And we ended up being able to offer a plethora of training opportunities for our coaches that aligned with our work. And but we engaged experts around growth mindset to bring the concepts of growth mindset to our coaches, and so that they would understand what that means and what that looks like. We then established a growth mindset working group. So one of our staff who actually did a thesis on growth mindset led coaches through this program where they all worked together and shared their learnings of bringing growth mindset to life on deck. We had a whole host of different training opportunities for our coaches that were incredibly well attended and quite fabulous. But each one was deliberately selected to be able to contribute to the Evolve outcomes that we were hoping to achieve. In terms of prevention and environment and looking at the safe sport tools and inclusive sport, it was a lot of it was internal work that we needed to do at a policy level to be able to ensure that we're where we want to be, creating our resource page on our website. But we also had to respond to some issues that are more traditional safe sport. We had to address some water safety issues that have been happening. So we did take the opportunity to do that, but also created more pathways for our coaches to access training and our club executives to access training to understand what safe sport really means. And so we're fortunate in having done this upstream work that when the BC Universal Code of Conduct came out, it wasn't shocking and new information. And now it is a reference guide that in dealing with some scenarios this year that I've been able to go back to our members and refer them to that to look at, as well as our new policies. So a lot of it has been internal, but there was a lot of training as well, and work with Intro to Inclusion Incorporated and some different groups to really help us to better understand how our sport is contributing to limiting participation or not making everybody feel equitable in their participation in our sport. And another big component to that was a members operation policy came out of Canada Artistic Swimming. And so we are now as a PSO required to meet certain membership requirements from an operations perspective. And in turn, there is now a club operations policy, which creates new standards of expectation around governance and safe sport that our clubs are required to meet to be able to maintain their membership. There's another big change within all of this. And then finally, the sharing. And so along the way, whenever we had the chance, we continued to give our members updates on what was happening and the different projects that were going on, the different interventions that were taking place. But the biggest thing, again, out of our formula and what we perceived, what we saw would be happening was the peer sharing. And that was absolutely 100% the most meaningful work that came out of this, I think, was we did this specific work with them, but they had to share it afterwards. So it was, you can have Nadia's time, but we're going to expect you to report back to the rest of the members to share your experience with Nadia and what you learned as an organization. And that was incredibly meaningful. And it was the same with the growth mindset, that it was take that back to the coaches. You now have a responsibility to share that with other coaches in our community. Looking specifically at the project itself, we had some limiting factors and we had some unexpected outcomes. So I don't think I need to really rehash the COVID pandemic and how that may have impacted us, but we had expected and had the funding to be able to bring people together in a meaningful way and have face-to-face conversations and deal with stuff in a really meaningful way. And our funding came through, I think, in and around February of 2020. And so you can imagine that by March of 2020, we were completely shifting how we were going to deliver this program. That was a limiting factor, but also created some opportunities for us because our participation rates completely shifted. We had intended to be able to do some of these on very small scale. So it was going to be piloted with our provincial programs. So just our high performance coaches, for example, in those programs would be part of it because we were bringing them together already. So we would be able to have interventions with them. Same with some of our athlete work was going to happen. But because of the pandemic, we really opened up Evolve to our members. And because it all moved to an online platform, we invited everybody in. For some of the work we did, we invited all of Canada in to our webinars and our sessions, and that was incredibly meaningful. The timeline I mentioned from the front, it was initially supposed to be 2 years of funding. By the time Sport Canada got the funding to us and got all the approvals, we were really down to 18 months of time to change our culture. And that certainly was never going to be doable, that we would see a whole shift in culture in that time. But it was, what can we do in that time? The trusting relationships. This was one of the things of, I literally in our application, in our grant application, had to write a section of what if they don't come? What if we get the money? What if we create the program and no one comes to the sessions and no one wants to be a part of this and no one wants to change and grow? What would happen? So there was concern with trusting relationships and how we'd be able to move this forward. The last limiting factor that was completely unexpected, not on our radar, was the fact that in our sport, a class action lawsuit has been launched against our national organization by former national team members about in relation to them not creating a safe environment for them in the National Training Center. This forced the closure of our national team's training center for a chunk of time, and the class action lawsuit is ongoing. This has been a limiting factor in some ways, but an eye-opener for others of saying, oh wait, change needs to happen and something different needs to happen. So there's been some good and a bad with both the pandemic and the lawsuit in terms of it did impact us, but we came out the other side better for it in a lot of ways. Unexpected outcomes. When we opened up our learnings at the start of this, especially around growth mindset and around positive coaching strategies to the rest of Canada, the outcome of that was a group called the How Coaches Online Community. And that is now a group of, I think, about 250 coaches around the world who are committed to a growth mindset and creating a positive coaching environment for their athletes, primarily around artistic swimming. And we did not anticipate that something of that nature or that scale would come out of this. But as a result of the series of education that we offered, this did become a wonderful and ongoing outcome from the project. As I mentioned, we had the pandemic created a broader engagement of our members, so that was an unexpected outcome for us. And we've also talked about already both the lawsuit and the pandemic, that pandemic certainly created competing priorities, as there were a lot of other things to do in the same window, but we were very fortunate that we also had people's attention in a different way than we normally would. So our reach in the end for all of this is that we did increase the reach. We would have expected this to probably be around 50 if we had before COVID in our initial proposal. And in total, we reached 205 of our members and of coaches across the country and around the world. So in terms of coaches, there were about 100 of them, primarily female. Club executives, we reached 25. And putting into perspective that we only have 15 clubs on average, 15 or 16 clubs in BC, reaching 25 club executives is significant. And we had significant reach within all our board and staff for the work that we did. And 65 of our coaches, of our athletes. So with those athletes, again, if it had been limited to our provincial program only, that might have ranged from 20 to 25 athletes that we would have been able to reach. So we were able to kickstart things in a much broader way than we had anticipated. So the big piece to this, though, is the program evaluation and what came out of it. So our program evaluation was in partnership with the University of Ottawa and some of the research team there who work on shifting culture in sport. And what it consisted of was some pre and post intervention surveys. So before the project started, there were surveys that were administered to our members. And then after we did all our interventions, there were surveys that were, but most importantly were the impact statements, and that the research team did very broad interviews with board members and staff to really find out what shifted, what changed, what were the true impacts of the interventions that happened. And we did do similar, that we interviewed coaches and executives. Now, because of the timing of when this all ended, which was the end of our season leading into summer, we didn't get as much uptake in coaches being willing, or club executives. The season was over. No one was really willing to give up their time in the same way. And that was just, again, everything being shifted with the pandemic and the timing of things. We didn't get as much of the qualitative data from coaches and executives as we would have liked, but still very reasonable. And what did we find? So basically, the researchers found that the Evolve Initiative exposed a broad base of members to a variety of interventions, that our members are more self-aware of opportunities to reflect on how individuals contribute to culture, and that there were new opportunities created to share and peer, and that came out of the research that we did well with that. The conclusion of it all really was that while there remains work to be done and change takes time, as we already knew, the Evolve Initiative has initiated important conversations within the BCAS organization about the need for the creation of a safe and inclusive environment for those in the community. There is an awareness present of changes that need to be made, but this awareness has, in general, not yet translated into measurable action. So we didn't completely shift our culture yet, but we've made great inroads onto that path. The evaluation also identified that sustained interventions are necessary for change to occur, and BCAS should consider this project an important step in the right direction towards real actionable culture change. What that looks like in a little bit more detail from the surveys is when we surveyed our coaches, no coach listed any of the interventions that we delivered over the course of the Evolve project as having no value. So everything we did had value in some to everybody that participated in some level. They indicated that the most impactful learnings were around communications, growth mindset, and our coaches learning to work as a team instead of individually. Other takeaways that were noted were around building connections and building the network among their coaches, validating the skills that they already have and teaching them maybe how to leverage those skills a little bit better, managing conflict, seeing the big picture instead of being very hyper-focused on just what's happening with their team or their club, and striving towards common goals. This to me is so incredibly meaningful though. We did ask them, because of Evolve, what are you doing differently now? And our coaches said they're listening better, better communications, applying conflict management strategies, creating group guidelines, which is a Nadia takeaway, focusing on safe sport, having fun, which should have been there before, preventing negative emotions from influencing actions, teaching growth mindset, and leveraging their network of peers. Coaches also in the survey identified that 75% of them believe that the Evolve project helped them to communicate more effectively and enabled them to better manage issues and conflict when they arise. And 100% said that Evolve allowed them to embed positive coaching practices with their athletes and help them to create fair, safe, open, and inclusive spaces for athletes. And no coach deemed the project as not being valuable, but most ranked it that they thought there were more benefits in that initial phase to clubs and BC Artistic Swimming in establishing some of the frameworks that were needed. When we talked to looking at the surveys of our club executives, they found that the most impactful learnings were the conflict management training, the This Is How We Roll workbook, which is written by Nadia as well, and was given to particularly the clubs who participated in the pilots with her. They learned the importance of communication expectations and establishing them, the value of listening and considering others' perspectives, of keeping calm, and that negative emotions should not influence actions. And because of Evolve, they indicated that they are now adding team building activities to preseason events and activities. There's now setting behavior expectations, applying communication strategies, recognizing others' perspectives, and striving to instill compassion in their interactions. And among the club executives, 100% believe that the project that Evolve helped them to communicate more effectively, enabled them to better manage issues and conflict, have allowed them to understand how embedding positive coaching practices with athletes on deck is critical, and help them to create fair, safe, and open, inclusive spaces for athletes. And they all ranked the project as valuable or very valuable for themselves and their organizations. Unprompted and just, the end of any survey, do you have anything else to add? We got very positive feedback of, this project was a step in the right direction. This was extremely important for our sport in both BC and Canada. Absolute overall, I'd say an appreciation for us putting in the effort and putting in the work to deal with the mush, to deal with the problems, to face the problems head on and try to tackle them. So at the end of the day, it's the big question, did we solve the problem? Not 100%, not completely. And we knew that in 18 months that wouldn't happen, but we made progress. And Evolve contributed to starting to shift the culture to a new direction, but there is still much to do. So we're now building on the key findings of the project, and I'll just share those with you a little bit. So the project did affirm to us that our members had gaps in knowledge and understanding of policies, procedures, and practices that contribute to safe sport and positive culture. So one of the things that I will say to everybody is we create these new policies, we create the BC Universal Code of Conduct, and as an example, Via Sport has had to explain it to us, to come back and create presentations to explain it to us. We in turn need to go explain it to our members. And we need to not assume that our members are reading and then therefore understanding policy when it's created, because it's not necessarily happening. And so we need to invest in that. Another key finding was that the project was successful to reset the cultural foundation for us, but patience is needed. And it is a slow process, but a slow change is promising change that it's going to stick. So that is key to us being able to move forward. The project allowed for the facilitation, organization, collaboration, and distribution of informative policies and procedures and practices, all of which are anchored in creating a culture of respect, safe, and inclusive environments for our athletes to thrive. And that happens from grassroots through to high performance. And I will share what you see in quotes these are the words from our evaluators, not from us in terms of interpreting this. This is their findings based on the information that they've gathered. We're getting there in terms of trust. And so a key finding was that there still is a lack of trust. And I think even from a year ago when these findings were written, or 6 months ago, that has continued to shift as we've moved into a new season and worked with our members, that we're continuing to build that trust. But there is still a little bit of perceived lack of transparency and lack of trust that's there that prevents true measurable culture change from happening. But as we continue to work on our relationships, to use effective communication skills, to manage conflict when it arrives in a more effective way, then instead of going backwards and losing that trust and transparency, we're continuing to work towards the high trust culture that we want. Club mentorship and guidance. I think coming out of this, we can now reflect that we underestimated the amount of support that our clubs actually need. And, you know, when we think about it, we shouldn't underestimate it, because at the end of the day, most clubs are volunteer driven with high rates of turnover. And so there is ongoing training and education that's needed. There is ongoing support and guidance that's needed year over year. They don't all have great orientation for new board members that come in. People are just now handed, here you go. Here are the keys to the club, go do it. And so there is ongoing mentorship and guidance needed. And the more we can do that and the more we support our clubs, the more goodwill and trust we're building with our members. Differing perspectives and experiences create meaningful and representative decision making. So this is really about bringing in perspectives and it not being sort of the provincial show, the BC Artistic Swimming show, that when we get the input from our members in building programs or making change or presenting policy and how it impacts them and all of those different things, and we make sure that we have proper representation on our board of directors and all of those pieces, then we have meaningful representation of our members and they feel heard and feel that they have voice. And that leads into the fact that active listening is a significant contributor to mitigating and resolving conflict. And I think we often think we're actively listening, but quite often as we're trying to put out fires in a sport environment, you're listening as long as you have to just tell them how to fix the problem and move on. When did you really hear the problem? Did you really hear the issue? And so it's a matter of listening for change and listening to help them find solutions, not to give them the solutions quite often. It's a very different type of listening, I think, than we were doing before. And again, the ongoing education and training needs to be a part of what we do around communications and conflict management. So we've trained the current group of volunteers, but that will shift over the next couple of years. And each year there's new ones. So the guidelines that we've created help us with that, and policy helps us to establish baselines that won't change, but we're going to have new characters come in with new opinions, new thoughts, new ways of managing things. So it's an ongoing effort needs to be made to continue to provide this training to our members and to our own board and staff. And an interesting piece is that some of our members, and we're now almost 3 years into this project, are still figuring out where they fit into the Evolve initiative and still trying to figure out what their role is. A key at the beginning of this project was, after we announced it and we told everybody what it was, my president and I met with every single club president. And sometimes the two of us met with the club president together, but we kind of divided and conquered, and we each met with presidents to discuss the project, but also to have a very meaningful conversation about where does their club need help and where therefore could they fit into the project. So where could they prioritize their time if they couldn't do all 6 components of it. And that was really important. We, of course, had people eager to get involved and to learn. And then we had people standing back saying, no, this doesn't need to be me. I don't need to be a part of this. So we continue to have that regular spectrum around change of early adopters versus late adopters and all of those pieces, but people are still trying to figure it out. What they are seeing is that change is happening, and that if you don't get on board with being part of this new culture, there may not be a space anymore for the negative. There may not be a space anymore for the old way of how our sport used to be. And again, creating space and opportunity for collaborative planning and learning, that it really gets us buy-in and optimism and from our members and our participants. And we've had great success with that in the last year since then. Another key finding is that meaningful coach development opportunities covering a broad spectrum of technical, tactical, and practical strategies was really important. So, every year, I think most PSOs are looking at what will we do for coach development this year, sort of thing, and really making sure that you're looking at it from that broad perspective, and that it may not always be the things the coaches come up with, because we often survey them to say where are the gaps, what do you want to learn, but sometimes we need to tell them some of the things that they need to learn as well. And that's been very successful for us in them branching out and learning new things that they wouldn't have necessarily looked into on their own. For us, there's an interesting thing and a finding which isn't necessarily relative to this presentation, but our long-term athlete development model, our Sport for Life model, is basically inverted in BC. We have more competitive athletes than we do foundational development grassroots athletes. And what we have been able to do through this project is help our members to understand that this is inverted and we need to flip it. And so there's a commitment, and more of a commitment among our members, to build the foundation and build grassroots programming and understanding that if we build a strong foundation, we will have stronger at the top, at the competitive and high performance level as well. And another finding was that the project allowed our community to realign with their goal of creating the best possible environment for their athletes. So somewhere along the way, we got a little bit lost, and our researchers recognized that and found that we are moving towards the path. So we all talked about that we were being athlete-centered, but I don't know that we were on the same page in what that meant. And so to Natalia's point earlier, we seem to be now in a place where we all understand what athlete-centered means, and that it's more than just performance-based. And it's more than just a pizza party here and there and some of those things. So it's no longer jargon. It's starting to have more meaning. And we're seeing this even as it takes its influence at the national level as well. And I think a big thing is facing the mistakes that we made. Again, whether it was me at the helm when historical mistakes happened or negative experiences were experienced, I'm still now responsible for this organization and recognizing where we went wrong and recognizing how we can move forward in a better way. And so it's very easy to just say, well, that wasn't on my watch, so it's not my problem. It still is my problem, because the hurt hasn't gone away from some of those things, and that has to be acknowledged. And so that has been a very important piece of us being able to move towards a safer sport experience and being able to rebuild relationships in our sport, is acknowledging where things went wrong and how we hurt people and making amends. Really being deliberate around embedding true sport in what we do and having safe sport mechanisms. We're creating the positive model, which is fantastic. And we're very fortunate right now that this is being modeled by our national association. So we will have consistency in that from top to bottom in our sport in Canada, which is fantastic. The other piece being, and we were talking about this actually before we even started the presentation, online actually creates a more equitable experience. When I first came in meeting with some of our clubs in the interior, I literally walked away from some of those meetings saying they literally want me to move mountains, and I can't move those mountains. I can't change the geography of our sport. But what we've been able to acknowledge is there's so much we can do online now where everybody can be included in what we do. From our competitions all the way through to our meetings and workshops and different things. So it really changes how sport can be delivered and how it will be experienced as we move forward. And again, the peer sharing and the nurturing collaborative environments has been absolutely key to to how we've been able to be successful with the project, but also how we will move forward. So giving our members a voice is the most important thing that we can do to be able to nurture a positive culture for our sport. So if we look at this a year later, so a year later after all of this, sort of has settled, and where are we? We do have a fantastic, and I think a very motivating strategic plan that centers around this athlete-centered community that we talked about, that we understand, that it's that holistic approach to developing an athlete. And that translates right into our gold medal profile now in high performance athletes. It's not just about those measurable, tangible execution and performance-based testing. It is about how we've supported the overall development of that athlete, both mentally, psychologically, and as humans. And that's a key to everything that we're doing moving forward. As it relates to safe sport, we've created a lot of opportunity for our members to understand how all of these different components contribute to the safe sport environment and creating safe sport. From our commitments as an organization, our mission, vision, and values, a national now reporting mechanism that now exists to be able to address issues of safe sport, and that we're leveraging and taking advantage of the resources that are out there. There's no need to recreate wheels. So we're building on what exists. We have some of the most strict coaching certification standards in the country for our sport, but we've continued to push the bar of what we expect our coaches to know and understand to be able to ensure a safe environment. And in addition to that, we've created the communication guidelines. We're the first in our sport to have a trans inclusion policy. We have a very comprehensive conduct policy suite that includes an equity, diversity, inclusion policy, includes a true sport policy, includes all of these pieces of, these are the base expectations now in our sport. And then around injury prevention and clean sport, there are other components, and one in particular that we've been focusing on is the water safety component that can't be left behind. So you've heard us mention a few times the communication guidelines. So I will share with you, this is our board of directors communication guideline. And so this looked at first and foremost, and we built this with Nadia, that it was very much around what are the values that influence our behaviors at the board level. And then we looked at, well, where do all these behaviors and values then fit in? So we have our own meetings. We have our meetings with our provincial partners and our funders, with our national association and other PSOs. And then we have big picture, our events that we host with all of our members. And so then within those, we've created behavior considerations and behavior commitments that our board aligns with. And this breaks down quite a bit into more language. But what I will say is that this document is front and center at each of our board meetings, that this is part of our board package. It's part of what comes up on the screen at the start of the meeting. And our board is committed to reviewing it on an annual basis and after AGMs when we have new board members, to ensure that it's still relevant, to ensure that we're updating it as needed. The next step was to create a similar agreement with our members of basically coming to an understanding of how will we all communicate with each other? How will we treat each other? And we had a very interesting, you can imagine trying to get everybody's input into this was a complex process. And we've pared it down to this draft, which we're still going to fine tune with our members. But we looked at, again, the context. Well, what are the different contexts? We have the community context. So that's actually what's happening at the club level more than anything else. We have our own organizational context, our meetings with our members, club meetings. And then there's the provincial context, when we all come together for our competitions and events, when there's travel involved, and our Ignite program, which is our provincial program. And again, our members identified, these are the values that influence the behaviors in all of these contexts. And very interesting, I think the list was almost verbatim what the board list was of values. So what we certainly know is we've got the same values at all levels within our sport, which is fantastic. And then again, it's then defining. So what are the considerations within and what are the commitments we're going to make around communications? And so this will, once we fine tune it with our members and workshop it a little more to get it exactly where we want it to be, will again be something that we bring forward at the start of meetings and competitions and different things to make sure that our members align with it and make sure we all remember that we're working from the same page. But these tools that we ended up creating really help us to be able to keep the Evolve message alive. So keep those learnings alive. This is a great way, a great thing to pass off to the next club executive as they take over to be able to say, and by the way, these are the standards. These are the expectations for behavior and communications among our sport. Another key piece of where we are today is that our national association has now launched the Rise Up initiative, which is their culture change project, for lack of a better word. And as it aligns with Safe Sport as well, it looks at all these different components of how we can make sport better for our members, and that it needs to change on a national level. And that's going to influence each province going forward and at the club level, so that there is alignment again through our entire sport. So this looks at safe and welcoming sport in terms of policies and reporting mechanisms, awareness and education, training and support, and then the health and well-being. And this is a really big change for us, is around sport-life balance. And this does focus specifically to our national program and our national athletes, but very relevant as well when you get down to the province and the club. But it aligns with our gold medal profile now, that there is a foundation of building skills and technical and tactical abilities in sport, but there's humans that need to be developed, more importantly. And so it does look at the sport-life balance. How do you support athletes after their career? Mental, physical health prioritization, sleep, rehab, back to sport post-injury, back to sport post-concussion, all these various things of taking a new light of making the athlete truly centered in terms of their health and well-being as a priority. And then performance culture. One of the big things for performance for us is that we're moving into a new judging system, which is going to be a big shift for our sport. But a big component of this will be looking at how does that culture, and we talked about, we need to be able to have the same, whoops, did I stop sharing somehow? The same expectations on deck, whether you're at the club level or on the national team deck. And that, yes, there's a shift in the degree of training that happens, or the intensity of the training that happens at all the different levels, but the expectations for how we're treating each other need to be the same, whether you're in the grassroots Aquago program in Nelson, BC, or whether you're on the national team in training center in Montreal. So when I reflect very, very quickly on what I've seen in the last 4 years, it kind of came down to 4 C's. There's an incredible level of collaboration going on in our sport right now, which was not there 2 years ago. And there's a piece of that that's around our Coach Advance program. So working with those high performance coaches in particular to rebuild their relationships and get them on a different path. We quite literally needed a new high performance plan to be able to get the buy-in from the clubs and get the members to be able to move towards it. But we couldn't create that plan without the coaches being able to come together and sit around a table and really come to an agreement of what that should look like. And we couldn't get to that place because the coaches couldn't get along enough and couldn't agree to do it. And we're now there. We now have the almost final draft of this new high performance plan, and we have agreement for our path forward around this. We have the club operations work, and we're supporting our clubs in developing and supporting them in creating their club operations compliance. And there's inter-club collaboration that's happening at a whole new level, that coaches are talking to each other. There's peer sharing, there's inter-club routines are more rampant than ever, and we're creating more and more opportunities. We've increased the capacity of our clubs for at least the current volunteers have better capacity than they did 2 years ago to be able to run the organization professionally. And one of our strategic objectives is to professionalize our organizations, not just us, but our other organizations, our clubs and our members. And I'm seeing the difference in that. Around in communications, there's increased communications among our members and with us, and it's much more effective. A big thing that we've learned is to not spend all day on email communications when a 5-minute phone call could settle the issue. And we've really been making an effort to do that and to making the time to be more effective in how we communicate so that we're all clear and we all understand where we are. And then camaraderie. This past weekend, we had our first in-person routine meet. And I just kept saying to my staff, it feels different. It just feels different on deck than it did. And I know the pandemic has some influence on that. I know there are a whole bunch of other factors. We're just all happy to be here. But there was a different level of camaraderie that existed. I watched two coaches that 2 years ago barely would speak to each other, that when one won the gold medal over the other, and she was on her way up to get the gold medal with her athletes, that the other coach said, congratulations on the way by, and gave her a little nudge. And that there was positive stuff happening. A club that has had some issues with us in the last few years, their coaches came up and were speaking to us and engaging with our staff that they haven't done in multiple years. And so there's tangible change that's happening that might not be able to be perceived by others, except those of us that have been in it through this process, that these real things are actually tangible. And we saw most of our clubs, and this is an example of a snapshot from social media this past weekend, that our clubs were recognizing us in social media, which hasn't happened in the last many years, since I've been here. Kind of a thank you to BC Artistic Swimming for everything that they're doing. So, there was still that we need to change the trust, but I see change that's happening, and I'm seeing very tangible things on the ground as we deliver our sport this year that has been shifted. And I'm not going to say evolve is the only thing. The pandemic has changed a lot of things in a lot of different ways, but I do definitely believe that this has had a big influence on that. So in closing, one of the questions in our final report to Sport Canada was, what recommendations would you make to another sport organization that is going to undertake a project like this? And this was my list. I had 7 things that I would suggest to other provincial organizations or nationals. Listen and understand the contributing factors. So if you plan to engage in culture change or a shift in culture or a move towards safe sport, if you don't understand first the contributing factors to where you are today, you're not going to be able to effectively make change happen. So the work that we did on the front end to find out our issues, doing the good, bad, and the ugly, was absolutely key to us be able to understand where we were, because if we don't know where we are, we can't make a plan to get to where we want to go. Be patient, support the early adopters, and be patient with the resistors. They will come around. They really will. They'll see the benefits along the way. And if they don't, then maybe there's not a space for them anymore. Engage the experts. Without Nadia, without our consultant, who's actually a clinical counselor, without our organizational change experts, we would have been left spinning our wheels. And it is really key. And that's very easy to say because we had funding that allowed us to engage the experts in doing this work. But it is absolutely critical to not trying to go it alone necessarily, because you're too inside what you're doing to be able to see the bigger picture. Be open to self-reflection and criticism, both personal and professional. So you're going to hear things that you don't want to hear, and you need to be open to that, and you need to receive it, and you need to be able to step back and understand how you need to change too, because it wasn't just all our members that needed to change. Our board needed to reflect, our staff needed to reflect of how are we doing what we do, and are we being most effective? The time commitment to build or rebuild relationships, give a voice, and to develop trust and transparency is absolutely key, and it's so very worth it. It's so hard to make time for this, but like I said, the phone call to have a conversation with a member versus going back and forth in email and they still don't feel satisfied with the answer changes everything. And, quite often, I find myself still doing I don't really have time for that phone call either, but at the end of the day, the time was well spent and we got further along. And in fact, it usually morphs into other conversations that you wouldn't have otherwise had. Prioritize culture change and embed it into governance. So it does need to be prioritized. You need to figure it out that it is a key component. So the Evolve Initiative continues to be a standing agenda item in our board meetings, so that there's ongoing updates of what's happening and the different things that are happening. And then just my final bit is that you are stronger together. And when you nurture collaboration and bring your members together, your sport will be stronger. And we're certainly finding that we're coming out the other side much stronger than where we started. And that's it. Any questions?
Before we go over there, that was phenomenal and unbelievable. And I'm aware that we're over time a little bit. The other piece I'm aware of is that we're recording, and I'm not sure if everybody is comfortable, because we're going to post this recording in our learning center, if they're comfortable asking questions with record on or not. So I think I may turn recording off. But before we do that, I would love to share as much and as many of these resources as possible on our learning center, including this recording. And whatever else you are willing to share, those behavior agreements, that whatever, that peer-to-peer sharing, I think for you as a sport leader to share that across other sports would be phenomenal. And if we can help facilitate that, I would love to do that. So I will collate all of that from you. If people have questions, but they need to run, email them to me, andreaw@viasport.ca, and I'll put them together and send them to Jennifer, if that's okay.
Yeah.
For those of you who can stay on, Jennifer, can you stay on? You have a 6-year-old at home.
Yeah, I've got a few minutes. She may join me because my husband has to get to another meeting, but I can stay on.
You can come. Okay, well, I'm going to stop recording then, and we'll carry on with questions. Just give me a sec here. I always got to find the right button. All right, here we go.